for the reading of the Gospel. The Gospel can be found on page 819 of your pew Bibles if you would like to read along. The Holy Gospel according to St. Mark, the 7th chapter, verses 24 through 37. From there, Jesus set out and went away to the region of Tyre. He entered a house and did not want anyone to know he was there, yet he could not escape notice. But a woman whose little daughter had an unclean spirit immediately heard about him, and she came and bowed down at his feet. Now the woman was a Gentile of Syro-Phoenician origin. She begged him to cast the demon out of her daughter. He said to her, "Let the children be fed first, for it is not fair to take the children's food and throw it to the dogs." But she answered him, "Sir, even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs." Then he said to her, "For saying that, you may go. The demon has left your daughter." So she went home, found the child lying on the bed, and the demon gone. Then he returned from the region of Tyre and went by way of Sidon towards the Sea of Galilee in the region of Decapolis. They brought to him a deaf man who had an impediment in his speech, and they begged him to lay his hand on him. He took him aside in private, away from the crowd, and put his fingers into his ears, and he spat and touched his tongue. Then he looked up to heaven and sighed and said to him, "Ephphatha," that is, "be opened." And immediately his ears were opened, and his tongue was released, and he spoke plainly. Then Jesus ordered them to tell no one. But the more he ordered them, the more zealously they proclaimed it. They were astounded beyond measure, saying, "He has done everything well. He even makes the deaf to hear and the mute to speak." This is the gospel of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Please be seated. Grace and peace to you from God our Creator and from Jesus Christ, who opens the gates of heaven for all of God's people. Amen. In the year 1803, Napoleon Bonaparte made the decision to sell land to the United States. In what came to be known as the Louisiana Purchase, he sold 828,000 square miles of land west of the Mississippi to the U.S. government for what came out to about 22 cents per acre. His advisors tried to talk him out of it, but Napoleon was convinced. "Who'd ever want that land?" he said. 20th Century Fox sold George Lucas the merchandising rights to all things Star Wars for just $20,000. The 20th Century Fox executives were convinced that this movie series, it would never catch on. Lucasfilms has earned more than $3 billion on the merchandising. In 1962, Decca Records told music producer Brian Epstein that 4-piece bands with drums and guitars were a thing of the past. So Brian took his clients to Parlophone Records, who were only too happy to sign the Beatles. Sometimes our inability to see alternative possibilities, to be open to the input of others, and to be, frankly, stubborn, puts us on the path of making sketchy decisions. I have a confession to make. I can be, from time to time, just a wee bit stubborn. Once I decide something, I kind of lock into that. Lori, my wife, will sometimes, frequently, say to me, "Todd, you're often wrong, but you're always confident." I have to admit, pretty much true. Anybody else here suffer from chronic stubbornness? I'm just curious. Anybody? I see a lot of spouses looking at each other, right? Well, for me and for many of us, to back off from a decision we've made and to change our mind can be something of a challenge. In our culture, whether we're talking about religion or politics or sports, we tend to dig in our heels. We stand by our thoughts and opinions even when they make no sense. Packers fans, I'm looking at you here. But in the world in which we live, we are constantly being bombarded by new experiences, new thoughts, new ideas, and by different perspectives that challenge our preconceived ideas. As we encounter these different perspectives, it might be helpful for us to remember this. Even Jesus changed his mind. Now, our gospel story today, the story of the Syrophoenician woman, is one of the most interesting and provocative stories in the Gospels. Jesus travels to Tyre, a northern city, a Gentile city, deep in Gentile territory. Now, this was a little unusual. Jews and Gentiles didn't mix. And when Jesus arrived there, he asked that his presence be kept quiet. But amazingly, word gets out that this Jewish teacher and healer had arrived. And soon there is a knock on his door. And a Syrophoenician woman, a Gentile woman, is standing before him. The woman came with a request. She begged him, really. Jesus, my daughter is possessed by a demon. No one has been able to cure her. Can you please help her? Can you please cast it out? Jesus' answer is not what we would expect. No, he said. No, let the children be fed first. Now, by children, Jesus was referring to the children of Israel, the Jewish people. Jesus' ministry was focused on these children of Israel, his fellow Jews. In fact, in Matthew's version of the same story, Jesus says to the Gentile woman, I was sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. No? Jesus said no? No to healing someone in need? No to a sick little girl? But Jesus had a strategy. And his strategy was that he was going to help the lost sheep of the house of Israel. Why? Well, way back in Genesis, God had said to Abraham, go to this new land I'm going to show you, and I'm going to make you a great nation. And through that great nation, then all nations will be blessed. So the children of Israel are meant to bless all the families of the earth. But to do that, they themselves need to be first healed and made whole. That is what Jesus was doing. That was his strategy, focusing first on the healing of his own people, and then out of that healing will come restoration for everybody else. The Syrophoenician woman, well, she didn't fit into Jesus' strategy. So Jesus turned to her and speaks and says, let the children be fed first, for it is not fair to take the children's food and throw it to the dogs. Okay, if I ever gave a sermon titled, Things I Wish Jesus Hadn't Said, this would be at the top of the list. Did Jesus really just call this woman and her daughter dogs? Yeah, it looks like it. Well, this statement by Jesus is so surprising and so troubling that scholars and theologians have been trying for centuries to find a way to explain it away and to soften it so that it doesn't sound like an insult. They've argued that maybe it was a mistranslation, or maybe Jesus was just being playful. But I don't think so. No, this really sounds to me here like Jesus is being insulting to this Gentile woman and her daughter. He calls them dogs. So if you were this woman, how would you respond? If your last hope for any kind of relief or healing for your daughter was Jesus, and you'd gone to him and he'd called you both dogs, how would you respond? Tears? Sorrow? Anger? Well, that's what I would expect. Instead, this woman does something unexpected. She doesn't argue. She accepts the comparison to dogs, and then she makes a case for dogs. She starts out by saying, Lord. Now, this is really actually very significant, and it has to catch Jesus' attention, because when this woman calls Jesus Lord, she is making a confession of her faith. She is saying, I believe that you are the Lord, the Messiah, the Son of God. Lord, she says, even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs. Now, in Galilee, where Jesus was brought up, in Jewish households, they did not have dogs under their tables. In fact, Jewish people did not even eat at tables. The Jewish people ate while sitting or reclining on the ground. And dogs were never allowed in the house. Dogs were wild. They were scavengers. They survived by eating garbage. They ate unclean food, which then made dogs unclean, which is why maybe Jewish people sometimes referred to Gentiles as dogs, because they were outside of the household of Israel and because they were considered unclean. But in Tyre, where Jesus was visiting and where this woman lived, the Gentile people did eat at tables. And people did keep dogs as pets inside their homes. And the dogs ate the same food as everyone else. After all, there was no dog food you could go and buy. They ate the food from the table when the family was done. And for thousands of years, Gentile children had been sharing their meals with their pets under the table. So what this woman is saying is, Jesus, maybe in your country, dogs are outside and unclean. But here in my country, in Tyre, dogs are a part of the household and they get the same food. They get the scraps from the children. You call my daughter a dog? Okay, she's a dog. She may not be in the household of Israel, but she is a part of the household of humanity. This woman's words are powerful and surprising and moving. And Jesus sees in this woman what he has been preaching: humility, persistence, and trust that God's boundless love knows no borders. In that moment, Jesus changed his mind. I can visualize Jesus looking at the woman with a smile growing on his face and telling her, for saying that, you may go. The demon has left your daughter. Now, Jesus' ministry is still going to be to the lost sheep, but in that moment, Jesus decides that it is to all of the lost sheep, regardless of boundary or border. Now, this is an important story. It was important because the early church was wrestling with the issue of Gentile inclusion in the church. And for them to resolve that difficult issue, some people were going to have to change their minds. And in this gospel, what the writer Mark is saying to his own congregation was, look, even Jesus changed his mind. Now, in many ways, we aren't all that different from the early church. We still wrestle. We wrestle with how we connect with and serve the whole world, not just the parts we like. We wrestle with how we welcome those who are different than us. We wrestle with how we live the faith and the values that Jesus taught: humility, persistence, and trust in God's boundless love. Jesus reminds us today that we have to be willing to change our minds when we learn something new. And sometimes amazing things happen when we are willing to change our minds. This past week, we hosted the funeral for Gail Arnfeld, who with her husband Paul have been members here at Trinity since 1960. Gail had an amazing and beautiful spirit. And I asked Paul if I could share just a part of their story with you this morning. Now, both Gail and Paul grew up in New Richland. They'd been friends since 6th grade. After all, it was just a small town, and pretty much everybody knew everybody, but that was it. They were classmates and then just friends. After Gail graduated from New Richland, she entered nursing school in Rochester. One night, Gail was supposed to go out on a date with this boy that she'd gone out with a few times. But Paul, this guy that she'd known, she'd grown up with, he was just kind of around and available. And suddenly, Gail had second thoughts. She wondered if maybe she wouldn't rather go out with Paul. And so she changed her mind. She called and canceled the first date, and she and Paul went out. Now, Paul was pretty convinced that it was because he was driving a brand new 57 Chevy. Maybe it was the car that caught her eye. But whatever the reason, it was clearly meant to be. And on January 8th, 1960, the two of them joined their lives together in marriage, a marriage that lasted 58 years. And along came their daughter Liz and their son Patrick, and then granddaughters Allison and Zoe, and then a full life here in Owatonna with friends and family throughout the community. And on Tuesday, when we celebrated Gail's life and her resurrection into the presence of God, this sanctuary was full. There were close to 300 people here. And there was sorrow. But there was also the joy of a life well lived and an amazing legacy that was so visible for all of us to see. All because that one night, Gail changed her mind. I'm convinced that in that moment, when Gail changed her mind about going out with Paul, God was up to something. Amazing and powerful things can happen when we are willing to change our mind. As we unpack all the implications of the good news, as we discover all the implications of God's boundless love, from time to time we are going to be challenged to change our minds. I guarantee it. We are like that Syrophoenician woman. Jesus traveled to Tyre. Likewise, Jesus comes to us. And we meet Jesus. And we bring Jesus our needs. And because Jesus changed his mind, we too, Gentiles, all of us, receive the boundless love of God that is for all of God's people. And in that, we will discover what God is up to. Let our love for others reflect that boundless love. And as we experience what God is doing in the world and within our lives, let those experiences open our hearts and our minds to be willing to think differently about the world and the people around us. When we are challenged, let us be open to having our minds changed. After all, if Jesus can change his mind, so can we. Thanks be to God. Amen.